Good evening, everyone. It's 5 o'clock, and I will call the workshop of the Victoria City Council to order. Our workshops are informal, and with that, we'll just dive right into our agenda. We have two items on our agenda this evening, and the first is a conversation with Sheriff Kammerud about how the city and the sheriff's office can strengthen its partnership. Sheriff Kammerud is here with Commander Wollin. Welcome to both Sheriff and the Commander this evening. I'm going to give just a brief background here, and then we're going to engage in a little bit of conversation. The purpose is really to learn about policing services and how that need may evolve over time as our community grows and evolves. We didn't plan for any formal presentation this evening. Rather, we are going to have more of an informal dialogue about how we can work together to provide a safe community for our residents, businesses, and visitors. And some people, especially our newer residents, may not realize the city doesn't have what we would call a traditional police department. Rather, we contract with the Carver County Sheriff's Office to provide policing services in our community. This model has some benefits, but it also has a few challenges. But let's just start with policing in general. It looks a little different today than it did 5 years ago or 50 years ago when this model started in Carver County. So focusing on today and looking into the future, let's talk a little bit about some information, what you hear from residents and your deputies hear from residents about what they expect from policing here in Victoria.
Madam Mayor, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I think that when we talk with constituents throughout the county, it's pretty universal in terms of their interests related to policing. They're looking more towards a little bit community-oriented, some problem-solving, more education than enforcement seems to be a pretty common sort of thing. I think that when we juxtapose that to some other communities, they have a different sort of thing. And so what we see on the news might not be totally reflective of what we hear and what we're seeking in Carver County.
Yeah,
and certainly if the council members have heard anything different from their constituents, by all means, let me know. But sure. That is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think generally our residents feel really safe, and that's a really important thing. We talk about if you don't feel safe in your community and in your home, nothing else really matters after that. So it's really it's an important service, and it's certainly one of high visibility now. Mm-hmm. Council, I open it up here. I just stick your hand in the air and go ahead, and we'll talk a little bit about. We'll get your questions answered. I know a lot of us are new around the table, so it's really a first experience with the Sheriff's Department. So, yes. Judy, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I was glad you brought up the fact that the residents are wanting more education than enforcement. And what I was hoping that we could come away with tonight is some ideas on how we can do that and work with you so we can get more visibility of the Sheriff's Department out there so that there's more of this community involvement. Is there something that we can do like that, or is this totally statute-oriented?
No, there's all kinds of things that could and should be done if that's the direction that the city chooses to go, right? These are all staff driven sorts of initiatives. And so if you think of it like if you had your own police department, what would you do? And we are able to do all of those same things under the contracting model.
Okay.
So there's two tiers, right? And a city manager articulated it this way, and it really made a lot of sense. There is the sheriff requirement, the statutory obligations that the sheriff has to do countywide. And we talked about that when we talked about the history of contract policing a few months back, right. If you recall that. Then there is this contracting piece, which you just happen to buy it through the sheriff's office. But if you had your own police department or a joint powers agreement and a police department through others, or you were contracting with a municipal agency, you would have those same sorts of community outreach activities. And those are all available to the city if you choose to pursue that.
Do you have some ideas as to how we could achieve that?
Well, go ahead, sir.
I know certainly in the last fall, so there, we have a liaison deputy, which is Corporal Hanson, who's assigned, who should be working with Ms. Hardy kind of hand in hand as it relates to some of those city things. Should have happened last fall, where he worked with Ms. Hardy in relation to just an overall city work plan, and that would be comprised between our deputy, Ms. Hardy, if there's input from the council as far as how they want some of that to look. And so if the council stresses, what they would like to say as far as education versus enforcement as it comes to ordinance things or things that are being dealt that way, then certainly some of those things can be spelt out as far as the work plan, and then that's built in for the contract deputies within the community as far as how they go about policing.
I recall when we talked, when you were here last fall, you said we kind of divide things into a third, a third, a third. It's like a third paperwork, and then a third stuff that we have to do, and then a third of we get some say in what the last third. Am I remembering that correctly? You are remembering. Okay, good, because sometimes it doesn't always work as good. So on that last third that we've got this, I think that's kind of what we're talking about, is this partnership piece of things, and what does that look like for this community? And I guess I would be interested in knowing kind of how you arrive at what happens during that time period. Is that, I understand it's a conversation with us, but are there things that, maybe the deputies have in mind that, they're embedded in this community? I really love that sort of town cop idea where they're embedded in the community and the community really does get to know them. I'm curious about their input on what that time looks like for them, if they have some ideas about what they think would be helpful to the community.
Sure. I don't want to put words in the deputies' mouths, right? Because I think that's a conversation that Ms. Hardy could have with the liaison deputy, but I can tell you what we've done in other areas. In Chanhassen, they organized, the sergeants took the initiative and organized a coffee with the cops thing. We had sergeants in Waconia did the take a kid shopping at Target, one of those sorts of initiatives. And so we're pretty well positioned to do those sorts of things that are unique to your specific city, right? And, Target is in Waconia, so it made sense to do that there. And so there's a lot of opportunities and occasions for that to happen. I think the deputies would be looking for the green light from the city to go ahead and do some of those sorts of things. Now, one of the things that in Victoria that is a little bit different than the two cities I mentioned is your staff consists of all deputies. And so you have the line staff level. They do not have a tremendous amount of positional authority, access to funds, or the discretional decision-making authority sorts of things. Those other cities have sergeants, and or in the case of Chanhassen, they have a lieutenant who has much broader access than to funds to engage in these community outreach sorts of things. That doesn't mean we can't make the funds available to the deputy, but it's a little bit of a movement here, and I said early on, it's about staffing and how you're positioned on your staff.
So what you're saying is that we need the deputies to be doing what they're doing, but we need a sergeant or a lieutenant to do the things that we want in addition to what we're getting?
No, I think we could do this with deputies. I think we have to give them the green light to go ahead and do it. I'm sure they don't feel that they have the empowerment to do those sorts of things.
Okay, so they need the okay from us?
or they need it from you?
Yes, all of it. All of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is, this is the first time we've had this type of conversation with Victoria that I'm aware of, right? That doesn't mean it didn't happen other times. This is,
Okay.
and if we were to go to the town cops and in town here and say, hey, that we think the council is looking for thus and such in terms of community outreach, let's kind of noodle that around and see how we can put that together for the council.
Good.
I have a question just on, I wasn't around last fall, on the third, what that looked like. And what I'm kind of hearing is that there's the third that would fall under the city umbrella. Is that solely focused on outreach and education?
No.
Is that how I
we're not
understand?
doing any of that. A third is for enforcement, and a third is for the paperwork, and a third is supposedly the outreach. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
sort of. Let me just go back to that, and revisit that for your benefit and for those people who might be watching this later who weren't a part of that. What we do when we try to recommend the number of staff that a city needs for their policing, we do it based on a workload analysis, which some cities do it based on population. They might have one cop per 1,000 residents or something along those lines. To me, that feels a little bit too arbitrary. So what we do is we look at the workload. And so in the city of Victoria, we know that we have X number of calls for service. We know that of those calls for service, a certain percentage generate reports. We know an average report takes a certain amount of time. And we know how many traffic stops we make, and we know how long the average traffic stop makes. So we can add all that up, and that is the workload in the city of Victoria. Some of that's self-initiated, some of it's dispatch-initiated type activities. And so we also know that every employee has to fill out a timesheet, attend the sexual harassment training, emails, voicemails, gas the squad, clean the windshield, all those other administrative tasks have to be done. And we know that that takes about a third of their normal workday. So we try to set the call for service workload as a third of their workday, the administrative stuff as a third of their workday, and then we have that other third that is unobligated time where they could do community outreach, they could engage in preventive directed patrols, they could engage in any other unobligated type activity. It's more discretionary time. Sure. And based on all that, we do all the math and we say, okay, well, you need X number of employees to do that. That's how we get to that number.
Yeah. So no, thank you for that. That's helpful for bringing me up to speed on that. But I'm just wondering in terms of, we're talking about partnership and how the city and the sheriff's department can work better together. I think you said there's some areas of opportunity in the current structure. So what does that look like? What does that, how do we improve that partnership? How do we, as a city council, as a city government, how do we become more involved on various decisions that are being made? I think the community outreach and education is fantastic. I certainly wouldn't want to mute that discussion, but in terms of decisions and policies, in terms of how we're utilizing your contract services, right? How do we become more involved? And I say that somewhat from I've only been here a couple months, so I don't know any of the history of it. So if it's been covered before, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
But I'm just curious to know what that looks like, and what do you see some areas of opportunity where maybe more input from this side of the table would help you guys, clear up items, or if there's issues.
I think that's a terrific question, and I think it begins with dialogue. Until recently, many communities were content with status quo and weren't looking to have a significantly increased level of participation in a lot of those things. And so I think it begins with, just having some conversation, seeking out a mutual understanding, And recognizing, of course, that mutual understanding does not mean mutual agreement, right? And, you know, on those things where there is room to accommodate, I think we would certainly do that. In those areas where there is not room or not an appetite to accommodate, why then I think we would have to, you know, refer to the contract or you know, have further conversation or, you know, look at it from a different, you know, any of those kinds of things. But it really comes down to just conversations like this one right here, and trying to build that understanding. Does that get to what you were asking?
Yeah, it does at a high level, and I'm not here to say I know all the, you know, all what's in the contract and what was agreed to and what are some of the things that we agree to disagree on, what those line items might be. But you answered my question at a high level. But at some point, I think the discussion at some point would have to go to. I'm not saying that has to happen today, but what are those items that we as a city can help have a seat at the table to help drive some of those decisions, whatever they may be.
Well, and to that, I would say, which decisions would you like to be a part of?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Being new, I'm not saying I know what that laundry list of opportunities for improvement are. You know, so some of it is coming from an area of I just don't know the details. But I think that participation at that level from a new person just joining the group would be valuable.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, kind of like a list, a list of necessary, mandatory, optional, and just check off which ones we want. Would be really great.
It would be interesting to see if you could just do it à la carte menu, which is, it seems a little crazy in policing, but, you know, these are some of the things that you can provide. I want to share with you, I'm on a group called the Regional Council of Mayors, and we met this morning. And the conversation around, the conversation we were having this morning was around mental health. And May is Mental Health Month, so this is top of mind for everyone. And recognizing that it's really tough to be a police officer right now. They're at center stage all the time. And we appreciate what they do, and we want to have their back. How does the department deal with your police officers and their mental health and their ability to, you know, refresh every day and come back ready to start again? Can you talk a little bit about that? I think it's such an important thing, and we want to understand kind of what happens from your perspective.
Sure. You know, these being county employees, we obviously have a responsibility to do what we can to keep them, or at least give them the opportunities to be as reasonably healthy as they can be. And so the county does have a fairly robust mental health.
EAP.
Yeah, the EAP, Employee Assistance Program, that is available to all employees. And in that work group, they have people who specialize in first responders, public safety, that sort of thing. Internally, we have a chaplain program that is available for employees. And then we recently, in the last 18 months or so, started a peer support program internally, which is pretty common, starting to get to be more common in law enforcement because people are starting to recognize how the cumulative effects of stress and whatnot. And so, and we've rolled that out, like I say, within the last 18 months or so with, I'd say, varied levels of success. I mean, overall, I think it's been working, and it's definitely worth continuing to pursue that as a resource for employees.
And it's something that's spread out across organizationally, so we have deputies that are part of it, dispatchers, emergency management people, so it's reflective of our workforce, but it's, I think it's certainly been something that you're not going to hear about if somebody's maybe approaching something or approaching one of our, you know, peer support employees that are out there that are resources for somebody who might be, you know, struggling or something like that. But but certainly they have that ability to engage an employee who's gone through some specific training or maybe has a specific background that might be relatable to something they've experienced on their own, and as we try to overall maintain the wellness of our workforce.
Yeah, yeah, it's just, it's so elevated right now, and it's so important, and to your point, Sheriff, you know, the awareness of it is higher now than ever before. Another thing I wanted to ask about was a lot of cities are kind of going to a co-responder model. Can you talk a little bit about what that is, and if you have any plans to implement something like that here in Carver County?
We do indeed have plans to implement that here in Carver County, and in fact did do that a year ago. Yeah. And we have done two things related to mental health that I think are pretty different than what other counties are doing. First, the County Health and Human Services has crisis call takers. Basically, loosely, you might call it like the old suicide hotline kind of thing. It's not what it is, but for those who remember those days. We integrated that work group in our dispatch center. And what that does is it gives the dispatchers real-time access to what's going on in the field through that. The crisis call taker can begin the de-escalation process before law enforcement shows up. And likewise, dispatchers, when the officers are on scene, can feed real-time information to the crisis call taker. COVID put a little bit of a wrinkle in that, in that we split our employees. We kept them out so that only dispatchers were in the comm center. There's only 15 dispatchers, so if we lost half of them to COVID, which is very realistic with the quarantine rules and so and such, that would have been really detrimental to us. So but we're working to phase those crisis call takers back in. The other thing we did that is similar to, but I think quite a bit different than what other agencies are doing, is we converted a deputy FTE to a crisis co-responder. We created a new position in Health and Human Services to create a co-responder funded through the sheriff's office. And so we hired one co-responder who works under the supervisory umbrella of Health and Human Services, but is fully embedded in the sheriff's office. She's officed with our deputies in our Waconia office. She has a police radio that she can use to communicate and dispatch herself to calls and call for someone assistance if she needs it. And we set her up with a plain Jane car, detective type car to use. And that's what I think is different about a lot of agencies. So, many agencies have partnered with their version of Health and Human Services to have a co-responder, but they aren't fully embedded into that. And we are finding out that relationship with the mental health worker and the deputies, because they're at a major hub office, has built that relationship has been very helpful. We've also found, unexpectedly, but yet one of those really value-added things is this co-responder is very helpful for things that would not be mental health calls, but turn into it. So, example, mother finds her son committed suicide. Well, that's a death investigation with a secondary mental health piece for mom, quite possibly, right? And so we found that having the crisis co-responder for those types of things has been really helpful. And it's no secret that it's my intention to propose to the Board of Commissioners that they add a second co-responder in the 2022 budget year. You know, they have some pretty tough decisions to make in terms of funding FTEs and so and such, but there's 168 hours in a week when we respond to those calls for service. Crisis co-responder on an average, because of vacations and training and time off and such, I maybe get 30, 32 hours a week of coverage from her. So that means 3/4 of the time I don't have somebody there to respond with the cops. So I'd like to add another co-responder.
That's a really good example of something that's evolved and changed over the years in policing. As you look down the road, what else do you see similar to that? But, you know, these are fundamental changes in what we expect from policing. What do you see down the road?
You know, it's hard to predict because for many years, at least throughout my career, there has been this interest in sending law enforcement to calls they're not law enforcement calls, but we work 24/7, 365, and so we get dispatched to sort it out, whatever it is. And I think what we're seeing now is local governments are looking to not use law enforcement for those things that are not law enforcement related. And in fact, maybe it's better to build employees or create a workforce that's better prepared to respond to those specific things. And so if I were to guess, I think we're going to see perhaps a little bit of peeling back of law enforcement response to non-law enforcement calls.
Well, that goes to, in mental health, if someone is on the spectrum or in crisis, they react differently to someone in uniform than they do in plain clothes. And Allison, as the co-responder, at least in my view, and from the reports that I get from crisis, and Melanie Warm with the county, is the gold standard. We have, I would say. And so I think it's phenomenal that we've hit the nail on the head with this, and we're better able to respond to residents in the county that need this help versus law enforcement. And so that's why things are moving this way. And you're seeing, you know, there are different departments around the country doing different things with mobile teams and things like that. And hopefully we can get to a place here where we're similar. I think that's the driving goal is to become, I don't want to say autonomous, but at least the mental health aspect, we're able to drill down to the type of call through dispatch, what it is, and you've got a trained plainclothes with a trained co-responder that go out and deal with those specifically versus clearing and then attending, which is, I think, what we're doing now, right? Clear the...
Yeah, the uniformed law enforcement will go verify the scene is safe, and then the co-responder will come in. Sometimes the uniforms will stick around, sometimes not. It really kind of depends on how it's going. And we defer to Allison Montplaisir as the employee, and we'll defer to her judgment. But part of the reason we equipped her with a police radio is because that's the fastest way to get people back if things change.
That's very cool. I did not know that.
I'm just curious, you know, Derek makes a good point, right? Like, you know, people in that state of mind maybe don't respond as well to a police officer versus, but I'm assuming there's situations, right, where you might not realize it's a mental health call, and right, so actually I was in Carver a week or so ago when there was a call that someone had a gun, and I think it was ended up being some suicidal type things, but there's 2 officers there. And so I guess what kind of training do they have in those, you know, do they have mental health training to help in those situations?
Oh, for sure.
Crisis, yeah.
Our deputies have gone through, but in 2016 we started, perhaps even before that, but so 40 hours of CIT or crisis intervention training, and so our deputies go through that. Our new hires, we look to get them scheduled at some point to go through that, but it's a minimum 40 hours, and then the post or peace officer standards of training also requires continuing education as it relates to that. So we do make sure that our staff gets that training and you know, necessary to try to handle that situation. A lot of times what it takes down is just coming down to that time, and that time you spend with someone if the co-responder's not available, and you know, previously where you might spend 10 or 20 minutes on a scene where you're talking to somebody and you bring the paramedics in to just place them on a transport hold to get them better evaluated at a medical facility, you're now spending more time and engaging them, and doesn't still mean that you won't get them somewhere else where they get those resources to better help them, but you know, that time spent and that relationship and the engagement piece.
As we grow, I mean, I'm going to kind of shift tracks here a little bit, but as we grow, I always think about our current multiple calls. How many times do we have multiple calls for service within the county, or where a deputy's either tied up or we need to call from a deputy come in from another community to cover? And the reason I'm asking that is because we're looking at 300 to 500 new homes over the next 2 to 3 years, 5 maybe. But that's roughly 2,000 new people, maybe 1,500 to 2,000 new people. I think multiple calls, or logic would tell me that multiple calls for service are only going to grow as well. So what are we looking at in terms of if we know, I mean, if we added deputies during a window of time where we'd be able to still be able to patrol for traffic-related violations and answer some of those other calls for service that cover Victoria. And so I'm just curious, is that something that you see as necessary? Because I know we're on 8-hour shifts, and we've got, I mean, if you say we have 3 deputies, but it's only on 8-hour shifts, 4, I think, to cover vacation and things like that. What are we missing? What are we missing as we grow?
Well, I think as we look at the workload analysis, pardon me, the city has more personnel than the workload suggests. And that is because the council previous, I believe, made a decision that it was a city priority to have scheduled 24/7 coverage. And so there is capacity there to pick up additional calls still, because you're already +1 what the data says that you would need. I think one of the benefits of the contract policing that a lot of people don't fully understand is when you have calls in the queue that are stacked, because you're using the county service resource, the general patrol deputies come in and handle that, and you get roughly the same experience. Your citizenry has roughly the same experience that they would have had it been your town cop had gone to that, right? Because we go to the same trainings and we have the same policy manual and all of those things. If we were to look at the city of Chaska, who has its own police department, they are pretty well staffed to be able to minimize the number of times where calls stack. But it happens. And typically in those cases, the sheriff's deputies will go there, keep the peace, and then the Chaska cops would then come and handle that. Now, we would only go to their emergency calls. Non-emergency, lower priority calls set in the queue until they're freed up to go. And if you had your own police department, that is likely what you would expect in town here. But if you have officers on a priority call, any call, and another non-emergency calls comes in, a general patrol deputy tries to pick that up to not let those things queue too long and to keep a reasonable response time to those calls.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a couple more. So it just seems like, just from a distance, right, like the turnover rate for the call center, it's probably is fairly high, like maybe not, but I see, you know, dispatchers, right, like job postings for their, it seems like a decent amount, which I can see would be a stressful job. Is that, does that, I mean, would you classify it as turnover is high, and I guess how that affects services?
No, I wouldn't. In the case of dispatch, our attrition rate is not that high. You see multiple postings because candidates don't make the background or the psychological or some other part of the process bumps them out. And so we repost for those positions.
Okay.
So those are not new vacancies, those are vacancies that we haven't really been able to staff
That makes sense.
like we wanted. Now, I will tell you that I think, and it is, dispatching is probably one of the most difficult jobs in the sheriff's office, because you have to be able to communicate on the telephone with the caller, communicate on the radio while you still have the caller on the phone, and you're likely communicating with your partner who is doing some other piece of the dispatching for you. Maybe they're coordinating with the fire department and it's germane to what's going on with the dispatcher who's on with the call at 911. And that is no small task, to be keying and talking and listening, and what you're keying and what you're saying and what you're listening to aren't related to, they're not the same. They're all related to
Right.
each other, but they're not the same. It's a tough, tough gig.
Yeah.
Walk us through that a little bit. A call comes in and the dispatcher picks it up. Is it the dispatcher's decision who gets dispatched to the call? Like the dispatcher would either call you, or does the call go out to everybody and you guys make your decision about who's going to respond? What's the process?
The
there?
software that they use provides some of that detail for them. And so they would get the call, starting with the address and the nature of the call. And as they start their keying, and as it starts to populate, they can click drop-down menus, and that will tell them what to go to or who to send to it. And so in the case of like a medical call with the fire department, for example, when it drops down, it will say, all right, sheriff's deputy. And then it'll be, okay, do they have a duty crew on? And yes, they do, and it continues to drop down, and Chief Hager has filled out a matrix saying, if we have a duty crew on and it's this type of call, these are the resources I want allocated to that call. And so the dispatcher then knows to dispatch those resources.
Interesting.
Software.
It's-
You need that
Miraculous.
software.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
And the software really, it's good news, bad news, because the software drives it, but it has limitations as well. And so we're having some dialogue related to medical calls for service with fire chiefs right now, for example, because the needs and interests in Victoria are different than the needs and interests in Hamburg or New Germany or Watertown, what have you. And the software has some limits to it, and as does the employee's ability to dispatch differently depending upon the agency. And so I say we don't have fully customizable dispatching. We have what I would categorize as semi-customizable dispatching. But we're trying to build a mechanism to get after those needs for the agencies. And the same, is true with the policing part. We can't be fully customizable for every city on the policing, but I sure think there's room there to be semi-customizable. And these kinds of conversations is how we're gonna be able to figure out what the city's looking for in that service delivery.
Another question that came to mind was, do you have like a citizens advisory committee that helps you sort through things that you're thinking about, or that provides feedback to you on your services? That's the best word I can think of for it, is like some kind of a committee that says, who are the people that are, consuming this service? And what is their feedback on it?
I do have a citizens advisory committee.
See how much I'm learning here? It's
that
incredible.
I put that together in early 2019, and it's a pretty good cross-section, in my estimation, of citizens from east and west end of the counties, and understanding that the east end is more suburban and the west end is more rural, and so that's why I make the split. I'm just, and I talked to them about various policy decisions that we're entertaining, because I kind of have a pretty good sense from working with and being around cops for the last 30 years. I kind of know what the cops think about it, but what I don't know so much is what does your average citizen soccer mom think about these sorts of things? And it's been very helpful for me to have those conversations with that group and try to, get that sorted out. I have another group that I work with. We call it, we call them Crucial Conversations. And that's a different group of people, and it's a little bit more diverse, and those conversations relate mostly to bias and how biases might be impacting the delivery of police services. And so I use both of those to kind of help us sharpen the saw a little bit.
So is that, is the information shared, is that available for people to read if you weren't on the committee or if you weren't part of the crucial decisions, that the data that's shared? You talked about policy decisions that the Citizen Advisory Committee may be a part of. Is that information available?
We don't generate a tremendous amount of data from that. It turned out during COVID, it ended up being much like in a normal year, I would have these types of conversations individually with people at, pick your pancake breakfast or whatever, right? And you kind of get a feel, and we didn't quite get there. We do have some data available that people would look at, but it's really much, they're not a voting board. It's a group of interested citizens who are willing to do a little research and ask their peers and friends and colleagues and come back and share that information with the rest of us.
Is there a process if someone wants to serve on one of your committees or councils? Is there a process they go through? Like, is it, like for us at the Planning Commission, we have a process and we take applications and we interview, and is there a process like that for?
Yeah, it's nothing that formal. It was,
Okay.
I solicited, notes of interest,
Okay.
back in 2019, and if people had an appetite to participate in those conversations, I would welcome the additional perspectives, and it's as easy as an email or phone call
Yeah.
saying, hey, I'd like to be part of these discussions going forward.
Yeah, we all have enough work to do, I get that, but it seems like that would be something that would have great value for the citizenry is to have that kind of a, sometimes people just want to put their hand in the air and go, hey, I would love to serve on that kind of a committee or provide some counsel.
Yeah,
Give
most
them an
of the,
opportunity.
many of the people who are part of that went through our Citizens Academy, and then that kind of got them interested in that type of discussion, and they were seeking a little bit more opportunity to be more engaged in sheriff's office sorts of things without getting into the reserve or posse or any of those kinds of deals. So
Yeah, I think there's an interest to have people maybe formally give some input on those topics.
And I agree. If there's something we can do as a council to communicate that opportunity, I would venture to say most people don't even know that they have the ability to raise their hand and say, hey, I want to be a part of these crucial conversations. I didn't know such a medium existed.
The Citizens Academy, is that yearly?
well,
Or was it?
here again, the COVID really put a wrinkle in it, but what were we doing, about 2 or 3 a year?
We had been conducting a spring and fall Citizens Academy with COVID. Obviously that took where we weighed the risk versus the exposure and things like that. And so we're looking at probably hosting another Citizens Academy this fall.
Okay.
But I understand that the city just did the city
We-
does their own academy.
Yeah.
We do.
As far as public government, and I know, I believe Corporal Hanson had a part of that as far as advising on some of the law enforcement perspective and things
Yeah.
like that, but.
That has been a remarkably successful program for us, and I would think that it would be interesting to see if we could have some kind of a, once you've been through this, now you can go to here, and it just,
We'll send them over to you.
but it's been remarkably successful for us, and I think the more information that we can provide the public about how work gets done in the public sector is all good. It's all good.
Yeah.
Just curious, with the nice weather, starting up, I've seen a few posts on social media and stuff about car break-ins lately again. I'm just curious, one, are you seeing an uptick with the nicer weather of those type of things? I know they've kind of been a big thing the last couple of years. And then two, other than social media, do you guys reminding people to lock their car doors and bring in maybe their garage remotes and stuff like that? Are patrols, going through neighborhoods a little bit more and stuff like that? Just because you do see that uptick, it seems this type, now?
Yeah, usually as we get into the summer months, it's sometimes, kind of hit or miss, or to describe it as an uptick. But certainly a lot of those times, it's those crimes of opportunity. So at times we can engage the citizenry as far as, being mindful to, lock your doors, close your garages. It's not to say, Victoria is a safe community. You don't have a lot of person crimes. It still doesn't mean there's a lot of opportunities for someone to, go into your car if it's left unlocked, or we live in a safe neighborhood. I don't need to do that. It's still being mindful and having that in, to remove your valuables and things. And so our deputies, I know, certainly they get out the night patrols. I don't know if any of you maybe have ever experienced. You could talk to some of your citizenry, but certainly door hangers, or they've done it. They might knock on your door at 3 a.m. and wake you up, let you know your garage is open. I know the sheriff has, received from within other communities, an email follow-up to say, hey, while the timing was inconvenient, I appreciate what they did. And so certainly they get out on that through social media. We'll look to do some different things if we see some of that stuff going on. The big kind of uptick that's been going on, throughout the metro has been the catalytic converter thefts. And so some other cities are taking some measures as far as how they're marking those or doing different things, but that's something that's a little bit more, you can't secure that, as far as it underneath. But those things as it relates to theft from motor vehicle, just being mindful, take your valuables out. You do live in a safe community. It doesn't mean an opportunity wouldn't present itself that, whether it's juveniles, during school is out. Unfortunately, a lot of times we can see that it's that, and out late after hours, out after curfew. So some of those things when we're making contacts to enforce the county curfew ordinance or different things, there's a reason behind it, not just to, hassle kids, but because we see some of these things that happen and deal with the repercussions the next day. So.
My only other question would be, and it's kind of back to the subject that Elvin talked about early on, like, how can we be more involved, I guess, and stuff is, I guess just from as an example, right, we know, there's the encrypted radio is potentially coming, I think, right, and body camera type stuff. So do you communicate, I know, right, you obviously communicate with Dana and talk about things that are coming down the line, but I guess how much input do you get from the cities on, for instance, an encrypted radio? I mean, we have a tight budget, so we now have to budget for, getting the fire station, an encrypted radio. So, like, how much do you, I guess, factor in your communities that you work with in their budgets and how they can, how they're going to have to deal with these issues?
Absolutely a fair question. And when it is cost neutral, and it is within the discretionary decision-making of our office, we would typically not have a lot of dialogue with city management or city councils. In encrypted radios is an example of that. There is no cost to the city. We're only encrypting the law enforcement channel. And nothing is changing on radio use. The way it works today on unencrypted radios is law enforcement communicates with dispatch on the law enforcement talk group. Fire departments communicate with dispatch on the fire department talk group. And law enforcement and fire communicate with each other on we call it LEFD, the Law Enforcement Fire Department talk group. Encrypting the law enforcement talk group has no impact on city communications because your fire department will still communicate with dispatch on their FD talk group. Now, I am aware, loosely, but I haven't really been that engaged in those conversations. Some of the fire departments are talking about creating an encrypted fire department talk group to be used for operations where, a school shooting would be a perfect example, where the fire department might want to be encrypted as well, or like during the riots where they're using, they meaning the rioters are using the data coming through the radio to thwart the fire department's efforts to get to the scenes and extinguish the fires and that kind of stuff. And so that makes sense to me to do that, but I don't have any say over it. That's a fire department decision to make, and it's a city decision to make. If the city chooses or the fire departments choose to encrypt, we'll buy the key and you'll be able to communicate with dispatch on an encrypted channel. But that's a city issue. I have nothing to do with that.
So the follow-up question is, so, okay, if I understood you correctly, so you said that the police side will be encrypted, the fire department will not, so dispatch will be able to communicate with the fire department. So what about those, you said there's the police and fire one, so that one wouldn't be encrypted, I'm assuming, right? So like a call where there's an accident and the fire needs to respond as a first responder, they would.
Yep, fire department would be able to communicate with dispatch. If for some reason the deputies and firefighters wanted to talk directly to each other on the radio, they'll be able to do that still. Now, the radio system is a big, huge, giant computer, and it tracks everything. And so I know, for example, how many times your fire chief has pushed his push to talk button and on which channel he's done it. The computer will also tell me which channels he has selected and which ones he's monitoring. It's like, as soon as you affiliate with a talk group, it captures it. It's like how your computer creates cookies, right? And it tells you you've been to those websites. This does the same thing. And what we know from that data is the communications on FDLE, when the firefighters and cops are talking directly to each other, it's just not that common. I mean, it happens, but it's not a really common thing. But that's still going to be an open communication. What we find, and I think it's more expedient, is for law enforcement, if they have a message for fire, to go to dispatch, have dispatch relay it to fire. Because your chief is probably a lot better at managing multiple channels than I am, but it's tough when you've got multiple channels going at the same time and then someone calling you on one that you're not really monitoring that closely. It's just easier to go through dispatch and have them be the messenger of all of it. And plus, they keep notes then. So if we talk one-on-one on the radio, there's no written record of that. But if I communicate it to dispatch, they'll make a note, pass it to fire, and so we capture that in writing as well.
Thanks for the clarification.
In terms of, you had said if it's budget neutral, then there's typically not communication between your staff and the city. Did I understand you correctly?
Well, I think that's how I said it. I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate in all cases. I think it's going to be dependent upon the impact, right?
Service to the city,
What's that? If it's
the impact of the service to the city,
correct.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if we were going to change our uniforms to be tan with tan pocket covers and epaulets, I might not talk that through with the city because I don't see that being really significant in terms of service delivery. And I'm not doing that for, I just use that as a low level, that sort of stuff.
I like the uniform.
We do have a fashion committee we'd like to in such a conversation. No, I think this has been such a great conversation, and I think it's a really good kickoff to, I think, the kind of partnership that we're looking for. But I think the last question that I would have for you, and I leave my my colleagues to ask their final questions, but as we move forward, and we are going to start budgeting here because it's always budget season at the city. And what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about, and as community leaders, in regard to our policing and how things are happening today, and as we go into our budget and starting to think about some of those things, what are the things that we need to be thinking about, and understanding that we don't run police offices here, and just as community leaders, what do we need to be thinking about? That's the question.
You know, that's a terrific question, and I think that when we talked about the policing, the contract early on, and our history of litigation over police contracts, you'll recall that our goal is to simply recapture our costs. There is no profit being made by the county on the police contract. But we have all of the same things that you do in your workforce, right? We have a collective bargaining agreement, and they're going to see an increase in wages. Well, that means then if I have to recapture my costs, you're going to see that increase. I'm told, but I have not yet verified, you know, our health insurance. We did a 5-year thing. Well, we have another, it's time to renew that contract. And you've all been paying attention. Your health insurance drives costs. Well, that is an employee cost. And so I think it's, as city leaders, you have to be mindful that you have 4 other employees whose costs are not going to stay neutral. And so think about what those might look like. We try to provide the numbers early enough. I think we shoot for June, is in the contract?
Yes.
Right? So we try to get those numbers to you in June of where we think we're going to be, and then we get final numbers in October pursuant to the contract, so you have something solid to work with afterwards. Because I assume you don't finalize your budget, final till December sometime, right? Yeah.
All right, very good. Council, any
I just had one more question that I thought of is, so I think you said, sorry if the title is not right, but Chanhassen has a sergeant, is that what you said? Or it's, so I guess, is that part of your matrix when you look at, you know, we have 4 deputies, right, that we have, when we get to a point where we might need someone higher up, I guess, how is that determined? Or is it just, we say, hey, we want someone at that level in our contract?
Yeah, there will come that's a great question, and there will come a point where we will be recommending that the city go to a sergeant. And so Chanhassen, you know, we just go back historically, 20 years ago, Chanhassen had a sergeant and a handful of deputies. And as they started to add more deputies, they needed more supervision. And so they added additional sergeants, maybe even corporals in that mix at one point. Then they got to the tipping point where they went to a lieutenant with 3 sergeants and a dozen deputies, or whatever the number is. And Waconia had similar deal. They had deputies and liaison deputies, and then they got to the point where it just made sense. They had enough deputies. It was time to put a supervisor in the mix, and that's where they landed. And it typically starts to happen around the time the city is at the 24/7, 365 scheduled window. When you make your next bump, that's about the time to start thinking about buying up one of those as a sergeant. What that does, of course, is it gives the person a little bit more discretionary decision-making authority to deliver in the service delivery piece. They have access to some funds, and you know, they have some authority. So if things aren't going the way the city wants, they have that positional authority to hold staff accountable and whatnot. And so, you know, that's probably what your next step is. You know, the time frame on that is you know, largely up to the city at this point, because you already have a little bit more staffing than the workload says you need. But if that becomes a priority, because that's really what it is, we're talking about priorities here, you know, that's something we could certainly talk about. And when we shoot numbers this year, even if you don't want to consider it this year, we can certainly let you know what the 2022 cost for a sergeant would be, to kind of have that bar for future reference, or
Okay.
not. I mean, I would leave that up to Dana to make an ask if that's what
Yeah.
she wants.
That sounds great. In the meantime, I'm anxious to get going on finding a way to use that extra time to develop in the community more with the, coffee with the cop, the bus stop. Chan does the bus stop with the kids, and just making your presence known so that people feel comfortable and they don't go, oh,
Yep.
what did I do?
May 28th, it opens up a little bit.
Yeah,
now,
I'm
right?
pretty excited about that.
Yeah,
So
right.
trying to come up with some ideas of what we can do to bring us back into the happy times.
Other questions? Final questions?
I had one more. Just, I want to kind of circle back on the crucial conversations that you said that you had been having. Can you share any of the feedback or what was learned, lessons learned from some of those discussions?
Sure. It was, so we started with a handful of local residents and a city council member or it's the mayor of Chanhassen, and a city council member from the city of Chaska. And we started just a little bit of dialogue. My original idea was that this group would be really a planning group and help us plan to find ways to have outreach with that 10, 12% of the population that feels their voice isn't being heard. Because I need to be able to hear all voices, just like you folks. Well, you want to hear from everybody and to make sure that you're making those kinds of decisions. And we've been through a variety of different discussions. We started that right before COVID hit. and so we've been doing it via Zoom, which has not been conducive to building the kinds of relationships that I think we need to have some of those pretty difficult conversations, frankly. But we've muddled through, and I think the last couple of meetings, people actually laughed. We got to the point where we could have some levity, which
Nice.
was pretty important to me. But we developed, the idea is to have a kind of a Know Your Rights campaign, and so we're using, building infographics for our Spanish-speaking residents to kind of help them know about what their rights are. In the Latino group, there's a lot of concern about local law enforcement and our possible arrangements with ICE. And what's not known is we have no responsibility to enforce immigration laws. We happen to have a contract with ICE to house ICE detainees who are detained lawfully under the federal system, and they don't have a jail, so they contract with local jails. And we have that contract, but our deputies do not enforce immigration, and so I need to help explain that to our Latino residents. And so there's a Know Your Rights piece. There is, I'm trying to think. We talked about kind of hosting kind of a Marnita's table sort of event where you kind of bring people together and have some dialogue. I want to keep it focused on law enforcement related topics because that's where my sphere of influence is. I don't have a lot, and it's got to be local law enforcement as well. I mean, I'm happy to hear about what happened to somebody in another community, but I don't have any influence on that. I can only set policies and parameters for our deputies. So we've had some of those conversations. We've had some discussions about drilling into some different training that, for your benefit, all of our employees have been through the Equity Innovation Center at YMCA, which is kind of the top tier of that caliber of training. This is an important thing for us in our office, and so we're going to try to do the right things right and get off to a good start with having better than check the box caliber training, which has kind of been where we've been in the past. So it's a long process. So the way it works is we meet about every 3 weeks. And so last time we had decided, let's do a little video on what to expect when you come visit, because there's a reluctance for Latinos, for example, to come and visit in the jail because they don't want us to tip off ICE and draw some attention to them. And so we put together a little video, and then we take it back to the group, and they kind of view, and they say, oh, yeah, change this, let's not do that. And so it takes a long time to do that by committee, meeting every 3 weeks, but we think the product is better. And so that's kind of what we're doing.
That's great.
And if you have people who have an interest in doing that, I think we're getting to the point now where the group is just a titch on the big side to really do this. And so it's probably time to start thinking about subgroups that, so the main work we're doing these last couple of weeks, in addition to the videos and whatnot, is we're trying to build kind of the mission and the vision of this group. And then as we build out subgroups, they could then operate under that mission and vision statements.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you again, both of you. Sheriff Kammerud, Commander Wollin. We appreciate having you in council chambers. You're always welcome here. And we appreciate the conversation this evening.
Thank you for having
Thank you.
us.
Thank you.
All right. Definitely. Next item on our agenda is related to our swimming pool fencing ordinance. Staff is going to be presenting information about the current ordinance, and presenting this evening is our planning and code enforcement tech, Izaak Peterson. Mr. Peterson, welcome to the council chambers. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the council. Again, my name is Izaak Peterson, Planning and Code Enforcement Technician for the City of Victoria. Tonight, we will be discussing a hot topic, and that is swimming pool fences. So tonight, we're going to look over what the city's current swimming pool fence code requirements are, and then discuss next steps in a potential ordinance review and direction for possible revisions on the code. So currently, the City of Victoria has a code that requires that all private swimming pools over 5,000 gallons and or more than 2 feet in depth at any point and over 150 square feet of surface area be enclosed by a 5-foot safety fence with self-latching and closing gates. This code generated some resident interest in the spring of 2021. Residents provided feedback requesting that the pool fence ordinance be evaluated and consideration of the use of automated pool covers be used as an alternative to safety fencing around pools. On March 5th, during the council's strategic planning meeting, council identified this as a topic of strategic priority for discussion. So as some background for the council, state law currently requires that all public pools have restricted access with fencing. To provide enclosure, that fencing has to be a minimum of 5 feet in height. State law does not require that private pools be enclosed with safety fences or have a barrier or enclosure. But statute does allow cities to adopt local ordinances that could provide a greater safety consideration with fences or other means. And the latter option is what Victoria currently does, as we currently regulate the construction and use of swimming pools by way of the city's zoning code, specifically section 18-11 swimming pools.
Mr. Peterson, I have a question for you. So that first sentence says, state law requires all public pools restrict access. Oh, but it does not require private. Okay, thank you.
Correct, Madam Mayor.
It's like, never mind. I looked
Little,
at that.
little distinguishment, as you could probably tell, a lot of cities like Victoria kind of pulled that 5-foot fence requirement from the state's law on public pools. Historically, that's what I've seen in doing a little bit of digging, but I think that's what happened locally here.
Thank you.
So why do cities have pool enclosure requirements, and why does the city of Victoria have a pool fence requirement? Historically, the CDC has identified child drownings as the leading cause of injury or death for children ages 1 through 4. As a reaction to that, there have been some studies, but not many studies on preventative measures for drowning and near drowning experiences. Pool safety fencing has been the predominant response to those drowning incidences. And there's been studies on the effectiveness on safety fences since the 70s. And they've been shown to prevent pool immersion injuries by up to 50% or more. Really, the fencing requirements are intended to require restricted access at the time of pool permitting to prevent pools themselves from existing as what's called attractive nuisances. An attractive nuisance is really a legal term that refers to the liability a property owner may have in the event a child trespasses onto their property and is attracted to an object that could cause injury. So preventing access to it to a greater degree. The metaphor that's used commonly to describe attractive nuisances is like a moth to a flame. So children don't always have the ability to use correct judgment. Therefore, some measures have to be taken to prevent them to reaching an object. So as some additional background, when staff or council or planning commission or whomever looks at city codes and rules, thankfully we have model code standards that are kind of set out there as industry standards currently. These aren't requirements, they're just a guide that many cities and authorities use. The International Code Council is one of the more preeminent or predominant code standard councils, and they've established some requirements for strong standards for pool enclosures. Historically, the ICC has used a 4-foot pool fence enclosure requirement as a standard, and recently, as of the 2018 edition, and these standards come out every 3 years, so we'll be getting new ones soon. The ICC allowed for ASTM approved powered safety covers, automatic safety covers, to be used as a barrier in lieu of pool fences as a barrier. And additionally, as included within your background packet for added reference, staff conducted a market city comparison of 16 cities in comparable size and layouts as Victoria. Within that comparison, mostly, majority of the market cities still required pool fencing around pools. 5 cities did allow for alternative forms of enclosures, such as automatic safety covers. Kind of a common trend line that staff observed as seen with, what cities do what is typically the less restrictive standards without fences, or the alternative standards with automatic safety covers are more common in communities with low housing density, like low density cities or townships where there's a little bit more space in between houses. So staff in your background packet included some topics for discussion, just to glean some general direction on the council's preference on the subject. Those are in front of you now. It was a pretty brief presentation, but I turn it back to the council for discussion, and I'll stand for any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, for that presentation. Council
Certainly.
questions? Okay, I'll start. I can start. So there's been a study that pool fences reduce drownings 50%. Is there a study on automatic pool covers? Have you been able to track one of those down to find out how effective they are? Because my assumption would be that somebody has to trigger that pool cover to go over the water and cover the pool so it's effective. So my question would be were you able to track down a study that showed the effectiveness of those?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Mayor, members of the council. I have not seen a specific study that, or a long-term study that has shown the effectiveness of pool covers. I think just given the issue and how technology changes over time, it's hard to say from staff's perspective on how effective they are. We do know that fences have been studied over time, so, but no, staff has not seen a specific study saying that, automatic safety covers are X compared to fences or something of that nature.
And just to clarify, the communities that have allowed safety covers tend to have been where they're not, maybe in neighborhoods as much as there are more distance between houses and that kind of thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mayor, members of the council, commonly, that's kind of what staff has observed. There are certainly exceptions to that. One instance would be like the city of Rogers, that Excelsior, that does not require fencing. And as many of you probably know, Rogers is kind of a suburban pocket in the North Metro that does have denser housing and a mix of housing. But more commonly, you'd find that in areas like townships or that are under county zoning authority.
So, no pun intended, but I'm kind of on the fence about this. Maybe pun intended, but obviously the code is there for a good reason, right? The safety of our children. But obviously technology has changed such that, there are other options out there. I mean, I feel like every time I looked, right, like I'd be like, okay, well, it's on the person to close the cover, right, to make it safe. But then again, a fence has a gate and a kid leaves the gate open and now you're easily in. Or you're a 4-year-old and you can flip the latch on the gate and you just go right in. So unless you have a lock, right, but the hard part is there's no foolproof things. And, I guess I'd be curious, and we probably don't know this, and I don't know if you can look it up, but like these cities that, went away from fences to covers if accidental drownings went up, right? Like have we seen, that go up? And I don't know if there's any way to find that type of stuff out.
I tried. I couldn't find anything.
I had someone mentioned, how would you feel if you had toddlers and you were buying a house next to a house that had a pool with no fence? Now you have the choice to live there or not, but
Put up your own fence.
it raises a lot of, and I guess my other question is, so we have the fence ordinance, but, if someone has a pool, you sell the house. What if the person takes down the fence, unless someone complains about it, you're not going to know about it. Same with and I kind of look at the cover, right? Like how, if the ASTM standards change or, you have that cover for 5 years and now it's not as in good working condition, like there's no one goes and looks at these things, right? And I don't know if that's a potential, right? Like you have to have a yearly check to make sure it's in good working order, which I don't know if we really want to get into, but I'm like, but it's just things I guess to think about of like, can we look at the, have a.
I think that's one reason the state doesn't, why the state leaves it for local control, because to go out to all the pools that are in the state to try to do, to add teeth to the statute, you'd have to fund it somehow, right? And that's where it's at with us. We have to fund something. It's much easier to see that a fence is faulty than it is to understand whether a pool cover is faulty.
When I'm wondering, could you have there's a fee, so you have an inspection fee yearly that would take care of those costs, but yeah.
Isaac, I don't know if you called them, but I did, because I don't know much about pools. I don't have one. And to understand this better, I called the Pool and Hot Tub Association, who does federal lobbying on this. And one of the things that they mentioned to me, which I was hoping they would have sent me the email that they said they were going to with supporting information, but right now it's just what they've said to me, is that the state of California, which has probably more pools than I would obviously say Minnesota does because you're allowed to use them a lot longer, is that they saw the trend go from fence to automatic pool covers, and now they're seeing this trend back to fences within municipalities because the pool covers aren't doing what they say they do. Now, one of the things that California has is they have a list of 7 different ordinances that communities can choose from, and you have to have 2 of them. And so I don't know if you can get that information to find out what a state that, or a municipality that has many more pools than we're probably gonna end up with, and kind of get us that information. I can certainly try to get it from the person I talked to. Was hoping, like I said, I was gonna have it tonight, but did not get it.
Councilmember Gunderson, Mayor, members of the council, I do know what you're referring to, and I believe it was a movement in either the late 90s, early to mid 2000s, where the state of California either allowed one or the other, either a pool cover or a fence, and then they saw deaths increase. I didn't want to bring it up because I couldn't quite remember specifically what it was, but I believe the quick and dirty of it was that they are reverting back to fences as the kind of protective measure of choice for pools. But I could certainly do a little bit more digging and pull that up if it would be useful.
What do insurance companies say? If you have a pool, how do you?
I actually had him check with his insurance company, and they said, fine, that they would cover him with a pool cover, the safety pool cover.
Yeah, but is there a difference in cost between a fence and a safety cover in the insurance policy? And I mean, are you
Is there more liability?
is there more liability with
He said no. He said no. And I have clients that are insurance agents, and I asked if they had any restrictions, and she said, no, we leave it up to the cities. So
Yep.
I went, okay. So what I did, I did a lot of research as well, trying to find if there was any more harm to children with the safety cover. I couldn't find anything either. But I did look, and these cities like Orono has no fence, you know, their lots are 2.5 acres. So you're out there, and it's, I mean, why put a fence up if you're out there? And I'm not saying that we should say either or, you have that choice in the entire city, but I do think that there are certain areas in the city that are more secluded and larger lots that could make that transition to a pool cover, safety cover with an annual, I was thinking with an annual permit with inspection each year, security alarm on the doors, motion camera sensors. And this particular application person is, I looked at his property. He's got the golf course behind him and a pond, and he's got one neighbor, and he's in a cul-de-sac, and he's 1.5 acres. So it isn't like there's little kids running around there. And 2 of the people that wrote in on behalf of him are his neighbors. So I think when you take something like that into consideration, I think we should offer up some sort of an option of like a variance, or like we do with builders with PUDs or whatever.
So if certain criteria are met, we would accept the fact that you could do a pool cover.
Yeah.
Staff, what does an ordinance like that look like? Is that a possibility? I mean, is it something that could, you know, if certain criteria is met,
They could make that option, that
a
choice.
pool cover would be, yeah, they could make that decision?
Mayor, members of the council, there's probably a million ways an ordinance revision could go. Staff could explore looking at different lot size thresholds that different standards could apply to, or, if there's a presence of a water body next to a pool, if that side of the property could just have a fence that projected into it 18 inches instead of having a fully enclosed size. But there's certainly more options available that could be explored. As with any code, something that staff recognizes and would want to ensure is that whatever ordinance route the city decides to go is that it's concise and clear, so there's no room for misinterpretation down the line, and everyone's treated fairly with it.
So would it be a variance?
Councilmember Black, Mayor, members of the council, one of the challenges with the variance process is that, the city has identified standards for variance approvals, one of which is that in the case of fences, you'd have to show that you could not otherwise place a fence on the property, and that it wouldn't be a self-created hardship. Planning commissions and the zoning board of appeal over time could probably have different review leanings towards that, but just based on the current city standards for variances, staff's impression is that it could be tricky for individual applicants to kind of get what they're shooting for on this particular topic.
Okay, well, so can we ask staff to look into more of the California options and how they have that set up and see what that looks like?
Yeah, I think now we need to direct staff on how we want to handle this. So our options are, do we want to explore an amendment to this? So currently we require a 5-foot fence. And I know we have allowed some 4-foot fences. So we've already diverted from this from time to time when we feel like it's okay. So do we want to explore an amendment to the current ordinance? Or do we want to continue to require a 5-foot fence as the ordinance is now? Council, does anybody have any preference about it?
I mean, I'm okay looking into it.
I would like to explore it further.
Okay.
I think it's a waste of time.
Do you? Alvin?
I would be okay exploring.
Okay. We have consensus here. Let's take a look at exploring an amendment. If we can find out some of those safety things, I would be grateful to understand what happens there. I too am not really inclined to change this statute, but we have a consensus from the council to take a look at it.
Mayor, members of the council, just an additional piece of clarification. So I know there was some discussion about potentially looking at this being limited based on size or density or distance or something. Is it the council that wishes to explore this? Do you want us to look at it from that light, or would you like us to look at it more from a citywide ordinance change perspective?
I personally would want it based on specific density and size, because we're building smaller lots now and they're going to be back to back, and I just can't see little kids running around in the shared backyard with pools with safety covers on them. I would think they would have to have a fence.
I think that would be a slippery slope on where we're at on what neighborhoods you decide you're going to allow
What
pool
would be on
coverage.
the size of the property?
Well, I know, but where are you going? Are you going half an acre or larger, or an acre or larger?
At least an acre to an acre and a half.
Well, then it's still a waste of time to do that in our where we're at now.
What do you mean?
In terms of what we're doing here, there's no lot. I mean, I live in the neighborhood with the larger lots. If you're in, how many acre lots are there in Deer Run?
His is an acre and a half.
In Deer Run? Okay.
Okay, staff, you okay with where we're going? It sounds like some reasonable, large enough lot that is a reasonable, large enough distance from the neighbors.
And consensus with the neighbors. I mean, I think before they could do that, they'd have to get the neighbors agreeing as well.
Yeah, but what happens when they move though, and new people
I
move?
mean, I mean, I'm kind of
Yeah.
changing
Well,
my
if
mind
they-
a little bit on
yeah,
this. I
if
mean,
they
I feel
move-
like it's a slippery
yeah.
slope. I mean,
So when he decides to, if he were to decide to do that and the neighbors on each side of them decide that they want, him to not have a fence, if he sells that, it's gonna determine what his property value is. He's taking a chance as to whether his property value will go up or down because of it. I mean,
Well, it's neighbors too, if the neighbors
and the
want to move.
neighbors, right, and if.
You gotta have
and
somebody who's agreeable.
I know that one of his neighbors wants to, sell their property, and it'll determine whether
I think,
that fence will make a difference, and the people that move in can put a fence in. I mean,
well, one of the things that we need to keep in mind here is we are making an ordinance for the entire city. We're not making an ordinance for the exception.
Yeah, that's,
So-
I mean, that's the property values. And how often, I mean, I'm assuming this is mechanical, so mechanical parts need to be replaced in a much more frequently than I would say a fence does, based on wear and tear. So, I mean, cost for, the homeowners, regardless of who's there, that has a pool cover, now they've got another cost. How are we, as a council and as a city, making sure that that homeowner understands the parts need to be? How are we able to add teeth to whatever statute that we have, that the parts, that they're doing what they're saying they're doing? Are they bringing us a report every year that they've had it serviced, and we know what parts have been replaced, so it continuously works?
well, it has to be, they have to get a permit and get a permit each year and have an inspection to make sure that it is running
So,
properly.
so that's staff time on the city's part.
Well, the permit would be a fee.
The permit would be a fee, and it's staff time to for the staff to go out and inspect.
would there be any liability for the city if we change the ordinance and, a kid drowns? Is it all on the homeowner or is it the city?
Yeah, funny, I sort of anticipated that might be one of the questions tonight. And I think the easy answer, I mean, we could get down in the weeds on it, but the easy answer is there's really not any city liability for considering making this change. There's obviously a very significant public policy question here, right? I mean, how do you want to protect kids in your community, primarily kids in your community? But yeah, no, as long as you make a reasonable decision about the pool cover, I mean, if we do it for something unrelated to safety, I think we start to get in trouble. But as long as we're making a decision where we think we're promoting safety or not interfering with safety, there's not a legal liability issue.
Council, how do we want to go on this? Do we want to explore an amendment?
I think I've changed so I think it's hard, right? Because it's, you want to be able to allow people to do things, right? But you also, the safety is a big thing. And I really think if it's just going to be the select lots, I think, like Derek said, that's a slippery slope, and I think it's going to be too difficult to maintain. So I think I would change and say we should just keep it the way it is.
Okay. Judy, or
Well, you just got outvoted.
Well, it's not, he didn't get outvoted. We're coming to a consensus for the community on what we think is the safest course of action for 10,000 people, not one, or
Right.
4, or however many live there. So it's not personal, it's what are we setting the standard for as we grow? And again, to make sure I had information, I did talk to Solveig Wilmot with the city of Edina, who does pool, and her title is not this, but she said she spends about 80% of her time on 300 pools, roughly. I mean, one a day, to make sure the city of Edina is covered. And I asked her about the pool covers, and she gets the request every now and again, and they typically shoot it down because she and the city, from that standpoint, don't feel that that's the safest course of action. And so having that, that's a like-sized, well, much larger community in terms of number, but in terms of the demographic, pretty similar to what Victoria is. I think a pool fence is not, I can understand maybe lowering potentially to 4 feet, because it's still at 4 feet. I have to make a conscious effort to get over that fence. I can't just hop over it. It's not something, and I'm 6'1", so getting over a 4-foot fence would still take some effort. I can't, if it's about the view, dropping the fence to 4 feet, maybe, with enough study that we can look at that. But to me, this is about safety, and there's too much that has the potential to go wrong in other neighborhoods, regardless of what size.
I would say, I think one of the reasons is an aesthetic reason, and I don't know if it's, there's lots of nice fences out there. I don't know if aesthetics is enough to do it, right? And if it's a cost, I have to believe these covers are not cheap, being, the safety features that are built into them. So I can't believe you're putting a big pool. I mean, you're already in cost too. So to me, I was on, like I said, I was on the fence, and I've been swayed to say I think we should keep it the way it is.
Okay. I'm for keeping it the way it is. Judy wants to change it. Derek's for keeping it.
I thought we were discussing if we were gonna
Look further.
further review, right? I'm not in, if we're taking a vote, keep it or no, I think that's different than
Further review.
for the
Okay.
review. And I'm fine either way. If we want to decide if that's an outcome of this meeting, then I'm going to have a different vote than looking to review.
Yeah. I think,
I just don't think it's worth the, like Derek said, it's probably not worth the time at this point.
For them to for the priorities that we've identified, I think spending staff time doing something that isn't a pressing issue
for a lot of our
for a lot of
residents.
other residents just isn't worth the time.
Okay. Very good. So it sounds like we're keeping the ordinance as it is, and we'll be moving on. Council, if there is no further discussion, we are going to adjourn the workshop. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second. Judy has a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We'll take a 5-minute quick break, and then we will be back to start the council meeting.